Welcome to your daily dose of theological German. We're on sentence number 7 and 8, I guess technically. We have 2 here, but if you just got the first one, you'd be disappointed, I think, because it just says, "Where does God dwell?" which actually is the title of the article we've been working on. So before starting on this next sentence, we need to just notice a couple of things that will help us. At the end of this first clause, you have a verb here, and it is in the infinitival form, and so that tells you that you're going to be dealing with some kind of construction involving an auxiliary verb. And so you might have a future construction, which is obviously not the case here. That would take the verb werden up front somewhere. So this is actually a modal construction. What's interesting though is that you'll notice this verb here, lassen, is not a standard modal verb, but if you look in the section on modal auxiliaries in any of the standard grammars, you should see a short discussion there of other verbs that can be used as modals, and lassen is one of those verbs. Here you'll notice that it's also used reflexively, and that based on this umlaut here, it's also in the subjunctive form. And so that kind of creates an interesting constellation of things to process as you work out how to translate this sentence. This is an interesting example of a time where a word that's very common, which you would normally not think to look up, can be useful to look up in the dictionary, because if you look up lassen in the dictionary, you will see that there is a whole section where it tells you what this verb does when it's used as an auxiliary and how the senses that it might take. And then within that, there's also a whole section that tells you about the reflexive use of this verb as an auxiliary verb. And so it's kind of useful to look through those and get a sense of how you might want to translate it. And in many of those examples, you'll notice here, for example, that you have subjunctive forms as well. So that's quite common. So to go ahead and translate, it could permit itself. Now, I've used could in English here, which is an extra modal now to this sentence. And the reason why is that in English, those kinds of modals are often used to kind of hedge a statement, which is the sense of the subjunctive, the way that it's being used here. And so you want to somehow convey that kind of hedging quality. So it could permit itself, it might permit itself, it would permit itself, something like that. It could permit itself to consider exemplary. I'm not going to translate this preposition on. It's not really necessary when you're using the English word to consider. So it could permit itself to consider exemplary one, and here I want to say one and not treat this as an indefinite article, because I think that's partly why it's italicized, but also you're clearly referring to a particular passage in the Old Testament. So it could permit itself to consider exemplary one text of the Old Testament which makes it difficult to answer this question. And here you have the zu construction, which is used to complement the verb here, machen. So that sounded a bit wooden. We obviously don't use phrases in English like it could permit itself. That's not a typical way of writing. So if you're trying to do a good translation of this, you're going to have to think about the discourse function of that opening kind of comment and try to think of something in English that would flow and create the same kind of sense that you want to have. So just to kind of go through this all at once now, where does God dwell? It might be appropriate to consider as an example one text from the Old Testament which makes it difficult to answer this question.